The carriage wheels, heavy with the day's-long journey, finally crunched onto the gravel of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor Vance watched the approaching edifice through the smudged glass, a faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke drifting in through the slightly open window. Her fingers, clad in fine kid leather, tightened almost imperceptibly on the silver handle of her small reticule. The grand old house, once a jewel in the county, now wore its neglect like a shroud. Faded stone, streaks of grime on the once pristine windows, and ivy that clung more like a parasite than an adornment, all spoke of a slow, inevitable decline. Eleanor felt a cold satisfaction unfurl in her chest, a feeling she had cultivated over many long, solitary years. This was not merely a house, it was a reckoning. A liveried footman, his uniform slightly threadbare but still worn with a faded dignity, opened the carriage door. The evening air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the distant strains of a string quartet, a fragile melody barely audible over the wind's low sigh. Eleanor stepped out onto the uneven flagstones, her dark charcoal wool coat offering little comfort against the true chill she felt deep within. She straightened her posture, the very act a silent assertion of her presence. Tonight she was not merely a guest. She was an architect of fate, walking into a history she had meticulously reshaped. Duke Alistair Blackwood stood at the top of the sweeping steps, his form silhouetted against the dim glow emanating from the manor's great hall. He was a man accustomed to being the center of attention, though tonight his greetings were perfunctory, almost mechanical. His blue eyes, once perhaps sparkling with youthful charm, now held a weary indifference as he offered a series of brief, dismissive nods to the arriving guests. He ran a gloved hand through his dark hair, a gesture of impatience rather than welcome. The air around him seemed charged with a brittle authority, a thin veneer over something far more fragile. Eleanor observed him from below, a quiet predator watching its unsuspecting prey. She noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cravat, a detail most would miss, but she saw it all. The Duke's gaze, sweeping over the small cluster of new arrivals, barely registered Eleanor's presence. He saw a woman, elegantly dressed, perhaps a minor gentry or a distant relative he could not quite place. His mind was already elsewhere, fretting over the evening's arrangements, the quality of the wine, the dwindling balance in his accounts. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, desperately clinging to a fading legacy. The faint scent of his expensive cologne reached Eleanor even from a distance, mixing oddly with the musty aroma of old stone. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible breath, drawing in the essence of this decaying world. As she ascended the steps, her gaze swept across the entrance hall. The once vibrant tapestries were now faded and torn, the polished marble floor marred by countless scuffs and chips. A layer of fine dust seemed to settle on everything, catching the faint light from the flickering gas lamps. The manor was a ghost of its former self, beautiful in its decay, yet poignant in its neglect. Eleanor felt the familiar ache in her own heart, a dull throb of past injustices that had brought her to this very threshold. The weight of her own history, a narrative woven with struggle and quiet determination, settled firmly on her shoulders. Duke Alistair, now closer, turned his attention to a bowing servant, offering a sharp, hushed instruction. His voice, though low, carried an imperious edge that Eleanor instantly recognized. It was the voice of a man who expected unquestioning obedience, a man who had never truly worked a day in his life. He looked down at the new arrivals, a faint frown creasing his brow. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, flickered over Eleanor for a moment longer than they had for the others, but without recognition. To him, she was simply another face in the crowd, one he would likely forget by morning. He extended his arm slightly, his heavy wool coat draped over it, a garment of rich, dark fabric that spoke of quality and expense, even if the man wearing it was teetering on the edge of ruin. The coat smelled faintly of old tobacco and an expensive but slightly stale cologne. His hand, adorned with a signet ring, gestured vaguely towards her. He did not ask, he commanded. His voice, a low rumble, reached her ears, laced with an unmistakable air of entitlement. "You there, girl? Take this to the cloakroom. See that it is properly hung." The words struck Eleanor with the precision of a well-aimed dart. Girl, the casual dismissiveness, the immediate assumption of her station, the ingrained arrogance that saw only a servant in a woman of substance. A hot, furious blush threatened to rise to her cheeks, but she suppressed it with years of practiced self-control. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She tasted the bitter tang of old resentment, a flavor that had become all too familiar over her lifetime. This was exactly what she had expected, yet the raw sting of it still found its mark. She did not flinch. She did not speak. Her face remained a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality, a skill she had perfected in boardrooms and negotiations where emotion was a weakness. She had faced far greater insults, far deeper betrayals, and had always emerged stronger. This man, with his faded glory and casual cruelty, was merely another obstacle, another piece in the intricate game she was playing. Her eyes, usually warm but now sharp with an almost predatory intelligence, did not leave his face. She saw the lines of dissipation around his mouth, the subtle arrogance etched into his features. The Duke, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior, remained in his pose, his hands still extended, the heavy coat still offered. He had already dismissed her from his thoughts, assuming compliance. He half-turned to greet another arriving couple, his attention already diverted. He was a man accustomed to having his commands instantly obeyed, without question, without hesitation. The silence that stretched between them, though brief, felt charged, electric. The faint sound of the string quartet seemed to swell, then fade, leaving only the distant murmur of other voices and the soft rustle of his expensive clothing. Eleanor took a single, deliberate step forward. The weight of her own coat, expensive and well-tailored, felt suddenly lighter than the burden of history she carried. She reached out her hand, her movements slow and precise, as if performing a ritual. Her fingers, still encased in the soft kid-leather gloves, closed around the coarse wool of his coat. It was heavier than she had anticipated, imbued with the scent of him, the scent of his careless privilege. A shiver, not of cold but of something far more profound, ran through her. This small, mundane object, Okoman, a simple coat, had suddenly become a symbol. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through Eleanor. It was not a spark of attraction, but a current of sheer, unadulterated resolve. She felt the warmth of his skin, the fleeting texture of his signet ring. For him, it was an absent-minded touch, a forgotten interaction. For her, it was a brand, a confirmation of the deep-seated contempt he held for anyone he perceived as beneath him. In that brief moment, a silent promise of future reckoning passed between them, invisible and unspoken, yet as potent as any sworn oath. Eleanor Vance took the Duke's coat, her expression unreadable, already envisioning the day she would return it, not as a servant, but as the true mistress of Blackwood Manor. The heavy wool of the Duke's coat still held a faint warmth from his body, a ghost of his careless presence. Eleanor's fingers, however, remained cool and steady as she took the garment, the rough texture a stark contrast to the silken lining of her own expensive dress. The brief brush of his skin had sent no shiver of fear through her, only a cold confirmation of the path she had chosen. His dismissive gesture, the easy arrogance in his blue eyes, all fueled a quiet, steady fire deep within her. She was not a maid, not a casual guest, and certainly not someone to be overlooked. This place, this entire world he inhabited with such unthinking entitlement, was already slipping through his grasping fingers. Eleanor turned from the Duke, a polite, almost imperceptible nod, her only reply to his imperious command. She walked away from the bustling reception hall, the murmur of voices fading behind her as she sought a designated area for coats. The manor's grand entrance hall was a cavernous space, filled with shadows and the lingering scent of old timber. A grand staircase, its banister once gleaming, now showed scuff marks and dull patches where generations of hands had worn away the polish. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through tall, grimy windows, catching on forgotten cobwebs that laced the corners of the ceiling. Every detail registered with a chilling precision. She found a small, recessed alcove, barely lit by a single flickering gas lamp, where a few other coats lay draped over a tarnished brass rail. With careful, deliberate movements, Eleanor placed the Duke's coat on a hanger, ensuring it would not touch the floor. It was a mundane action, yet for her it felt weighted with significance. A quiet ritual marking the first step of her arrival, a prelude to the main event. She smoothed the lapels of the charcoal gray wool, her movements slow, almost contemplative. The fabric was fine, no doubt, but the garment itself carried the aura of neglect, of something once grand but now merely existing. This coat, like the manor itself, felt heavy with the dust of centuries and the weariness of mismanagement. Her gaze drifted past the coat, surveying the walls around her. Plaster had cracked in long, jagged lines, revealing the ancient lath beneath. A faint, earthy smell of damp stone hung in the air, hinting at unseen water damage, at foundations slowly crumbling. The faded damask wallpaper, once a rich crimson, had bleached to a pale, patchy rose, peeling in delicate curls at the edges. She knew these details intimately, not just from her recent meticulous inspections, but from years of studying the Blackwood estate. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft that snaked through the ill-fitting window frames, spoke to her of a truth the Duke seemed determined to ignore. Blackwood Manor was dying, slowly, elegantly, but irrevocably. A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips, a private, almost melancholy expression. The estate was hers now, officially. The final papers had been signed just 3 days ago, in a discreet London office, far from the Duke's lavish but increasingly hollow existence. The ink was still fresh on the deeds that transferred centuries of Blackwood lineage, of proud, unyielding dominion, into her possession. The memory of that moment, the quiet click of the solicitor's pen, the rustle of official documents, brought a surge of satisfaction that hummed beneath her composed exterior. It was a triumph of patience, of meticulous planning, and of a relentless, unyielding will. The journey to this moment had been long, arduous, and often solitary. She had spent years building her empire, brick by painstaking brick, always with this particular goal simmering beneath the surface of her ambition. Every successful venture, every shrewd investment had been a step towards Blackwood. She had watched, she had waited, she had gathered intelligence, all while the Duke, oblivious and dissolute, squandered his inheritance with a reckless abandon that was both predictable and tragic. His reputation for mismanagement was legendary, whispered in drawing rooms and trading floors alike. He was a man born to privilege, but utterly devoid of the acumen required to maintain it. Eleanor remembered the reports from her agents, the defaulted loans, the undervalued timber rights sold off to cover gambling debts, the desperate attempts to secure new credit with increasingly unfavorable terms. Each piece of information had been a confirmation of his descent, a clear signpost on the road to his inevitable downfall. He had seen the land as an endless wellspring, a birthright that would forever sustain his extravagant lifestyle. He never understood that even the deepest well could run dry if carelessly plundered. He saw trees as lumber, not as future forests. He saw fields as rent income, not as fertile soil requiring care and investment. His was a short-sighted, greedy view, inherited from a lineage that had always taken without truly giving back. And that was the true core of her motivation, the deep, abiding wound that had festered for generations. The Blackwood family, for all their aristocratic posturing, had built their fortunes on the backs of others. Her own ancestors, humble farmers and tradespeople, had suffered greatly under their tyrannical rule. Stories passed down through hushed whispers, tales of land unjustly seized, of unfair taxes levied, of families driven to ruin by the Duke's forefathers, resonated within her. There was the Vance family farm, a fertile stretch of land bordering the Blackwood estate that had been swallowed whole in a dubious legal maneuver 3 generations ago. Her great-grandfather, a proud and diligent man, had fought tooth and nail, but the Blackwoods held all the power, all the influence. He had died a broken man, his spirit crushed. His family left with nothing but bitterness and a burning sense of injustice. Eleanor's grandmother had often spoken of it, her voice filled with a quiet, lingering sorrow. "They took what wasn't theirs, child," she would say, her eyes distant, remembering a pain that transcended time. "They believed their name made them exempt from honor, from decency." Those words had etched themselves onto Eleanor's soul, shaping her ambition, giving it a purpose beyond mere wealth. This was not just about acquiring an estate. It was about reclaiming a piece of lost dignity, about righting a historical wrong. It was a slow, deliberate act of justice, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The Duke's family had been arrogant, cruel, and utterly convinced of their superiority. They had viewed people like Eleanor's ancestors as little more than chattel, resources to be exploited for their own gain. The irony was not lost on Eleanor now, standing in the crumbling heart of their legacy, a legacy she now owned. The Duke, Alistair Blackwood, was merely the latest and perhaps the most pathetic iteration of that long line of entitlement. He was a man who had never had to work for anything, who believed his birth alone conferred worth, and who was now paying the price for generations of hubris. A faint shiver ran down Eleanor's spine, not of cold, but of profound vindication. She imagined her great-grandfather looking down on this moment, seeing the tables turned. There was no joy in petty revenge for her, no visceral thrill in his suffering. Instead, it was a deeper, more profound sense of balance, of the scales of justice finally tipping in the right direction. The pain of her ancestors, the silent tears shed over lost livelihoods and stolen futures, found a quiet echo in the cold stones of this manor. She had not forgotten. She had simply waited. Her gaze swept across the alcove, noticing the intricate but defaced carvings on the stone archway, obscured by layers of grime. This neglect was not just aesthetic, it was a symptom of a deeper rot. The Duke cared nothing for the preservation of this place, only for the superficial illusion of wealth it afforded him. He would sell off paintings, antique furniture, even entire wings of the estate, all to maintain his lavish lifestyle, never understanding that such actions were akin to bleeding a patient dry. He was a caretaker who had become a destroyer, cannibalizing his own heritage for fleeting pleasures. Eleanor reached up, her finger tracing a faded floral pattern on the wallpaper that was almost entirely gone. This house held so many stories, so many memories. It was a treasure, a repository of history, even if that history was stained with injustice. She intended to restore it, not just to its former glory, but to something even greater. Blackwood Manor would become a place of purpose, a center of innovation, a testament to what careful stewardship and modern vision could achieve. It would no longer be a monument to stagnant privilege, but a beacon of progress. The distant sound of laughter from the reception hall pulled her back from her internal reflections. The Duke would be there, holding court, basking in the attention of his sycophantic guests, utterly unaware that the ground beneath his feet was no longer his own. He would be oblivious to the fact that the woman he had dismissed as a servant held the very title to his ancestral home. The thought brought another faint, almost imperceptible smile to her lips. The anticipation of the revelation was a potent, heady brew, a moment she had painstakingly crafted over many years. She knew she had to re-enter that world, to resume the role of the observant, quiet guest. Her presence in this dim alcove had served its purpose, allowing her a moment of quiet contemplation, a final grounding before the storm. She had settled the coat, acknowledged the decay, and reaffirmed her long-held purpose. Now it was time to play her part. Eleanor straightened her dress, smoothing the fine fabric over her hips. She checked the discreet clasp of her pearl necklace, a simple gesture of self-possession. Her dark hair was impeccably styled, not a strand out of place. She stood tall, her posture regal, embodying a quiet strength that needed no outward display of power. A deep breath filled her lungs, steadying her. Her intelligent eyes, usually calm and discerning, now held a steely resolve, a hardening of her gaze. She was ready. She turned and began to walk, her footsteps silent on the worn carpet, preparing to re-enter the reception, ready to observe the man who now unknowingly stood on her land. The soft hum of conversation drifted through the manor's grand hall, a deceptive veneer over the building's quiet decay. Eleanor Vance moved with a purposeful grace, her steps barely audible on the worn Persian rug, its once vibrant patterns now faded to muted whispers of color. The air, heavy with the scent of aged wood and a faint, sweet mustiness, felt thick with unspoken histories. She had chosen her path through the less frequented corridors, allowing herself a moment to fully absorb the reality of Blackwood Manor, her manor now. Every creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet, every glance at the peeling gold leaf on the archways solidified her resolve. The walls, she noted, were not merely aged. They truly needed repair. They were not merely showing character. They were losing their structural integrity. Her mind, ever analytical, cataloged the necessary renovations, the cost projections, the careful plans that would bring this place back to life. It was a stark contrast to the illusions the Duke so desperately clung to. She emerged into the main reception room, a vast space where gaslight fixtures cast a warm, flickering glow, illuminating faces that ranged from genuine aristocracy to the more desperate hangers-on. The room was abuzz, a symphony of polite chatter, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. She scanned the crowd, her eyes easily finding Duke Alistair Blackwood. He stood near a towering fireplace, its stone hearth blackened with centuries of smoke, his back to her. A small circle of gentlemen, their faces flushed with wine and the warmth of a good story hung on his every word. Alistair's voice, a familiar boom she remembered from countless whispered rumors and newspaper reports, carried easily over the general din. He spoke with an expansive gesture, a half-empty glass of amber liquid held aloft in one hand. Eleanor observed him from a respectful distance, an uninvited audience to his performance. He was recounting, she gathered, some daring financial maneuver, a tale spun from half-truths and inflated numbers. The market, gentleman, and he declared, his chest puffing out slightly, is an untamed beast. One must possess not merely a keen intellect, but also the lineage, the inherited instinct, to truly command its whims. A murmur of agreement, a few sycophantic nods rippled through his small audience. Eleanor felt a cold smile touch her lips. Inherited instinct, he truly believed it. She recalled the ledgers, the damning figures she had reviewed just weeks prior in her London townhouse, pages filled with reckless investments and mounting debts. The man now pontificating about his keen intellect had systematically dismantled his family's fortune, gambling away centuries of legacy on fleeting fancies. Her own family, generations of astute merchants and industrialists, had built their wealth with painstaking effort, brick by brick, innovation by innovation. They had understood the market not as a beast to be tamed by bloodlines, but as a complex ecosystem to be understood through diligent study and hard work. Alistair continued, his voice dropping slightly, laced with a conspiratorial tone. One must understand the difference you see between genuine wealth and mere accumulation. True breeding dictates a certain elegance in one's dealings, a finesse that cannot be bought or taught. He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air, weighted with implied superiority. Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She remembered her grandfather, a man of immense dignity, forced to sell off a small but cherished parcel of land to one of Alistair's ancestors during a lean year. The Blackwoods had acquired it for a pittance, then built a hunting lodge on it, a symbol of their casual dominance. Her grandfather had never spoken of it with bitterness, only with a quiet determination to rebuild, to ensure such a vulnerability would never threaten his family again. Eleanor carried that determination within her. Alistair took a sip of his drink, his gaze sweeping over his admiring listeners. These new entrants into society, he scoffed, a dismissive wave of his hand accompanying the words, these industrialists, they amass fortunes, yes, but they lack the very bedrock of our society. They have no history etched into their very bones, no understanding of true value beyond the numbers on a balance sheet. His words were a thinly veiled jab, an aristocratic sneer at anyone who hadn't been born into the gilded cage he himself now struggled to maintain. Eleanor felt a prickle of indignation, sharp and familiar. It was the same sting she had felt years ago, in a different setting, when a young, well-born man had casually dismissed her business acumen as a charming novelty for a woman. It was the condescension that fueled her, the quiet fire that burned steadily beneath her composed exterior. She had built her empire on those numbers on a balance sheet, meticulously, strategically, enduring skepticism and outright disdain. She saw the raw, desperate fear beneath Alistair's bluster. He spoke of true value and breeding because he had nothing else left. His inherited status was his last bastion, and he clung to it with the ferocity of a drowning man. The manor itself, this grand old house, whispered tales of neglect, its very fabric crumbling slowly around him. Yet he stood there, an emperor without clothes, lecturing on the superiority of his lineage. The irony was almost unbearable. One of Alistair's companions, a portly man with a perpetually flushed face, chuckled nervously. Indeed, Duke, these new money types simply cannot comprehend the nuances. They build factories, they move goods, but do they truly understand? He trailed off, looking to Alistair for affirmation, a puppy seeking approval. Eleanor watched this pathetic display, her heart growing colder with each passing moment. Alistair beamed, accepting the compliment as his due. Precisely, my dear fellow. They are akin to skilled artisans, perhaps, but never true masters. They can build a carriage, but they cannot inherently know the noble path it should travel. He paused, his gaze momentarily distant, as if recalling some profound ancestral wisdom. They lack true breeding. There is no replacing generations of cultivation, of refinement. Eleanor's mind drifted back to the small, cramped office her father had once kept, filled with ledgers and the smell of ink and ambition. He had worked tirelessly, forging connections, navigating complex trade routes, building a foundation from nothing but his wit and dedication. Her mother, equally sharp, had managed their household with an efficiency that would put any duchess to shame, ensuring their children received an education that surpassed many aristocratic ones. True breeding, she thought, was not about bloodlines. It was about character, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to one's purpose. Alistair's voice, now tinged with genuine disdain, cut through her thoughts. And these unrefined industrialists, with their ill-gotten gains, often presume to dictate terms to those of us who have inherited not just wealth, but responsibility. It is a vulgar age, gentlemen, truly vulgar. He took another long sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the room, perhaps seeking any evidence of the vulgarity he condemned. He did not see her, not truly. He saw a woman, elegantly dressed, perhaps a guest of some lesser acquaintance, someone to be tolerated but not genuinely acknowledged. The memory of his heavy wool coat in her hands, the rough texture of the fabric, the faint scent of his cologne, returned with a sudden vividness. He had ordered her, a complete stranger, to take his coat, assuming her a servant, a non-entity. And now he spoke of vulgarity, of ill-gotten gains, of a lack of breeding. Eleanor felt a slow, deliberate anger begin to simmer within her. It was not a volatile, explosive rage, but a cold, calculated fire, refined and potent. It was the kind of anger that fueled empires, that brought down dynasties, that turned the world on its head with quiet, unyielding force. Each of his words was a fresh insult, not just to her, but to every ambitious soul who had dared to carve their own path, to earn their own standing. She observed the way the other men nodded, some with genuine agreement, others merely going along with the Duke's pronouncements. They were all complicit in this elaborate charade of inherited superiority, fearful of challenging the established order, even when that order was clearly crumbling around them. Their lives were built on these same fragile foundations of status and perceived lineage, foundations that Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, were about to be severely tested. Alistair, emboldened by their silent assent, leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. One must resist, you see. Resist the encroachment of these new forces. Preserve what is truly valuable. Otherwise, what will become of our traditions, our very way of life? He made a sweeping gesture, encompassing the grand yet fading manor around them. It was a plea, thinly disguised as a philosophical statement, a desperate cry to maintain a system that had long since stopped serving anyone but himself. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She saw the dust motes dancing in the beams of gaslight, the visible neglect of the very traditions he claimed to uphold. His family's way of life had been one of careless spending, of believing themselves exempt from the rules that govern lesser mortals. And now that way of life was ending. She was the harbinger of that end, the quiet force that would usher in a new beginning. His words, so dismissive, so arrogant, felt like a personal challenge. He had not just mistaken her for a servant. He had implicitly dismissed her entire existence, her achievements, her very right to stand in this room as an equal. The sheer audacity, the profound ignorance of the man was breathtaking. He had no idea the true cost of his arrogance, the price he would soon pay for his casual cruelty. She watched him, her gaze unwavering, her expression a mask of perfect neutrality. Inside, however, a storm gathered. The casual elitism, the smug certainty of his own superiority, the blatant disregard for anyone not of his ilk. It all coalesced into a sharp, burning point of indignation. Her fingers, concealed within the folds of her skirt, clenched briefly, a fleeting tension that no one could possibly notice. He raised his glass again, signaling a conclusion to his little speech. "Indeed, gentlemen," he proclaimed, his voice regaining its booming quality, "one must protect the sanctity of heritage. It is a duty, a sacred trust." And with that, he took a final triumphant gulp of his drink, oblivious to the fact that the very heritage he spoke of had already passed into the hands of one of those unrefined industrialists he so readily dismissed. Eleanor's eyes, in that brief, solitary moment, flickered. A cold fire, ancient and resolute, ignited deep within their depths, reflecting the gaslight with an almost imperceptible glint. It was a flash of outrage, raw and potent, quickly masked by the impenetrable composure she had cultivated over years of navigating a world that often underestimated her. The fire died as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the steely glint of unwavering resolve. She remained perfectly still, a silent, watchful shadow in the corner of the room, her presence utterly unnoticed by the Duke. A hushed anticipation settled over the manor's grand hall as a liveried footman, his voice resonating with trained deference, announced dinner. The murmur of polite conversation, which had filled the reception room, began to dissipate, replaced by the soft rustle of silk and wool as guests rose, a collective ripple of movement flowing towards the dining hall. Eleanor felt a subtle shift in the air, a transition from the light, social chatter to the more formal solemnity of the evening meal. Her gaze swept over the departing figures, each noble back and elegantly coiffed head representing a facet of the world she was about to irrevocably change. She walked with a measured pace, neither rushing nor lingering, allowing herself to become one with the procession. The rich, antique wood of the manor's floors creaked faintly underfoot, a somber accompaniment to the occasion. Dust motes, disturbed by the moving throng, danced in the soft glow cast by the flickering gas lamps that lined the long corridor. The scent of old stone, damp earth, and the lingering sweet aroma of aging flower arrangements filled her senses, a testament to Blackwood Manor's long, slow decline. She noted the chipped paint on a plaster cherub, the fraying edge of a once vibrant tapestry depicting a forgotten hunting scene, each detail a quiet confirmation of her assessment. The grandeur was still present, yes, but it was a frisson, a fragile skin barely concealing the rot beneath. Her own heart beat with a steady, quiet rhythm, a stark contrast to the tumultuous anticipation that swirled within her. She had spent years cultivating this calm, honing her patience like a finely sharpened blade. Tonight, that blade would find its mark. She paused for a moment by a tall, mullioned window, allowing a few stragglers to pass her by. Outside, the early evening sky was a deep, bruised purple, hinting at an impending chill. A cold wind rattled the ancient panes, a sound that mirrored the tremor of the Duke's financial empire, though he remained entirely deaf to its warning. Eleanor felt the coolness of the glass against her fingertips, grounding herself in the present, in this moment of quiet power before the storm. When she finally entered the dining hall, the scene was one of carefully orchestrated splendor, a last desperate attempt to recapture lost glory. A massive, polished mahogany table stretched across the room, gleaming under the warm amber light of countless candles. Each flame flickered, casting dancing shadows that lent an air of mystery to the proceedings. The heavy silver cutlery, intricately embossed with the Blackwood crest, lay beside pristine white porcelain plates, while crystal goblets sparkled, awaiting the first pour of wine. Despite the opulence, Eleanor's keen eyes picked out the subtle signs of wear, a small crack in one of the plates, a slight tarnish on a silver fork, a faint stain on the linen tablecloth beneath the centerpiece. Small details, perhaps, but they spoke volumes to someone who knew precisely what to look for. Eleanor found her seat with deliberate ease. A small, elegant card bearing her name, Miss Eleanor Vance, lay precisely placed at a prominent position at the table. It was not at the Duke's immediate right, a place reserved for the most senior guest, but clearly intended for someone of considerable standing. She suppressed a faint internal smile. The Duke, in his ignorance, had inadvertently granted her a front-row seat to his own unraveling. The chair, upholstered in faded velvet, felt surprisingly firm as she settled into it. She straightened her posture, adjusting the simple yet exquisitely tailored fabric of her gown, its dark, muted tone a deliberate choice against the more flamboyant colors of the other guests. She wanted to be observed, yes, but not to draw attention to herself in the way a peacock might. Her power was in her stillness. Across the broad expanse of the table, seated almost directly opposite her, was Lady Beatrice Covington. A flicker of recognition passed between them, a subtle acknowledgement that would have been invisible to anyone else. Lady Beatrice offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, her lips curving into a knowing smile that barely disturbed the serene composure of her features. Her silver hair, coiled meticulously at the nape of her neck, caught the candlelight, creating a halo around her astute, observant face. Eleanor met her gaze for a brief moment, a silent exchange passing between two minds that understood far more than they let on. Lady Beatrice's eyes held a spark of amusement, a hint of theatrical anticipation, as if she were about to witness a particularly engaging play. Eleanor felt a strange, quiet comfort in that shared glance, a sense of an ally in the wings, even if Lady Beatrice's role was merely to observe and perhaps to gently prod the narrative forward. The Duke Alistair Blackwood finally made his way to the head of the table, his movements still carrying that exaggerated air of self-importance. His blue eyes, though sharp, seemed to glaze over the faces of his guests with a detached indifference, as if he were performing a perfunctory duty rather than engaging with company. As his gaze swept across Eleanor, it paused for only the briefest fraction of a second. He offered a curt, almost dismissive nod in her direction, a gesture so devoid of genuine recognition that it bordered on insult. He had entirely forgotten the woman whose coat he had so imperiously thrust into her hands just hours before. In his mind, she was merely another face in the crowd, perhaps a distant, minor relation he had been forced to invite, or a low-ranking guest whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. Eleanor felt a familiar prickle of something akin to cold anger, but it was a distant, almost academic sensation now. It fueled her, certainly, but it did not consume her. She had long since learned to transform such slights into an unyielding resolve. His inability to truly see her, to remember her, merely underscored the depth of his arrogance and the magnitude of the fall awaiting him. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, a cage fashioned from generations of unearned privilege and a profound disdain for anyone he deemed beneath him. His bluster was a shield, his dismissiveness a weapon, but both were paper-thin against the reality she wielded. The conversation around her began to swell, a symphony of polite chatter and social pleasantries. Eleanor listened, absorbing the snippets of gossip, the veiled critiques, the carefully constructed narratives of wealth and influence. She observed the other guests. Lady Fitzwilliam, her jewels glittering like a small galaxy. Sir Charles, pontificating loudly about trade routes he barely understood. The young Miss Davenport, fluttering her eyelashes at a bored-looking viscount. Each person at the table represented a piece of the world she had fought so hard to enter, and then, paradoxically, to subtly dismantle from within. Her presence here, at this table, in this manner, was a testament to the quiet power of a mind that had refused to be confined by expectation or circumstance. A footman approached, pouring a deep red wine into her crystal goblet. The liquid swirled, catching the candlelight, its aroma rich and earthy. Eleanor took a small sip, letting the taste linger on her tongue. It was a good vintage, perhaps one of the last remaining from the Duke's once impressive cellar. She wondered briefly what other treasures of Blackwood Manor would soon be catalogued, accounted for, and repurposed under her ownership. The thought brought a strange mixture of satisfaction and a faint, melancholic awareness of the passage of time, of endings and new beginnings. Her gaze drifted back to Lady Beatrice, who was now engaged in a quiet conversation with the gentleman to her left, her expression thoughtful. Yet, every so often, Lady Beatrice's eyes would flick toward Eleanor, a quick, almost imperceptible glance that conveyed a wealth of understanding. It was a silent conversation, a bond forged in the anticipation of what was to come. Lady Beatrice knew. She had always known. Eleanor wondered how much of the unfolding drama Lady Beatrice had orchestrated, or at least subtly encouraged. There was a slyness to the older woman, a delight in the careful unfolding of human folly that Eleanor found both amusing and admirable. The Duke, meanwhile, was holding forth at the head of the table, his booming voice cutting through the general hum. He was recounting some trivial anecdote about a recent hunting expedition, his laughter loud and self-congratulatory. Eleanor watched him, seeing not just the man, but the embodiment of the system she had so painstakingly navigated. He was a symbol of the old world, resistant to change, clinging to outdated notions of status and inheritance. His pride was so vast, so utterly consuming, that it blinded him to the very ground shifting beneath his feet. She felt no pity, not yet, only a deep, abiding certainty that the time for his reckoning had finally arrived. The first course was served, a delicate consommé presented in elegant, shallow bowls. The rich, savory aroma wafted through the air, momentarily silencing some of the chatter as guests turned their attention to the food. Servants moved with practiced efficiency, placing the bowls before each guest, their movements almost balletic in their precision. Eleanor picked up her spoon, its silver cool and smooth against her fingers. She allowed herself a moment to appreciate the simple beauty of the presentation, the subtle artistry of the culinary staff, a testament to the manor's enduring, if fading, standards. Just as the last bowl was placed, the Duke cleared his throat, a sharp, resonant sound that commanded instant attention. Every head at the table turned towards him, a sea of expectant faces. He held aloft his wineglass, the crystal catching the light. A triumphant, almost regal smile played on his lips, a smile of a man entirely convinced of his own invincibility. He seemed to drink in the collective gaze, relishing his position at the center of this world. "To Blackwood Manor," he declared, his voice ringing with a false joviality, "and to the enduring spirit of tradition. May our prosperity continue, and may good fortune always favor those who appreciate true heritage." A chorus of polite murmurs and the clinking of glasses followed his pronouncement. Eleanor raised her own glass, her fingers steady, her expression serene. She met Lady Beatrice's expectant gaze across the polished table, a silent understanding passing between them, a shared secret held just beneath the surface of the polite society. The storm, though unseen by the Duke, was gathering strength, and it was now just moments away from breaking. The air in the dining room, thick with the scent of roasted pheasant and aged claret, hummed with a delicate symphony of conversation. Silverware chimed against porcelain plates, a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the hushed murmurs and occasional polite laughter that filled the grand, if slightly faded space. Eleanor watched the flickering candlelight dance across the polished mahogany table, reflecting the faces of the assembled guests like an array of distorted masks. She felt the cool weight of the heavy linen napkin on her lap, a subtle vibration of the grand old house beneath her feet, a testament to its age and the deep foundations it had once represented. The crystal glasses gleamed under the soft light, each one promising a taste of the manor's dwindling vintage. Eleanor's own glass of water sat untouched, a silent testament to her careful observation of the scene unfolding around her. Her eyes, calm and sharp, took in every detail, from the faded floral patterns on the tapestries adorning the walls to the way the Duke, seated at the head, held court with an almost theatrical flourish. She could discern the faint aroma of damp stone beneath the rich culinary perfumes, a subtle decay that only she seemed to notice. The initial pleasantries had given way to more substantial discussions as the first course, a delicate consommé, was served. Talk drifted from the latest theatrical productions in London to the unpredictable autumn weather, a safe and neutral territory for polite society. Eleanor tasted the consommé, its clear, savory notes a small pleasure amidst the tension she felt coiling within her. She watched the Duke, his face already slightly flushed from the wine, engaging in a rather boisterous anecdote about a particularly stubborn gamekeeper. His voice, naturally loud, carried easily across the table. Then, almost imperceptibly, the conversation shifted to matters closer to home, to the economic undercurrents that stirred beneath the surface of their seemingly placid lives. Mr. Davies, a local landowner with a perpetually worried brow and an air of quiet financial anxiety, cleared his throat. He dabbed at his mouth with his napkin before speaking, a nervous habit Eleanor had noted earlier. Indeed, Duke, he began, his voice a little strained, the market for properties seems quite active of late. There are whispers of considerable movements, particularly regarding some of the older estates in the northern reaches of the county. Duke Alastair, midway through carving a succulent piece of pheasant onto his plate, paused, the silver serving spoon clinking against the porcelain. A slight frown creased his brow, a momentary disruption to his otherwise jovial expression. He looked up, his blue eyes sweeping across the faces of his guests. "Ah, yes," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly louder than the polite din, betraying a hint of irritation. "The insatiable appetite of those with more coin than breeding, I imagine. Always sniffing around, eager to snap up what they believe to be an advantageous acquisition. They see only figures on a ledger, not the centuries of history ingrained in the very stones of these lands." Eleanor felt a cold prickle at his words, a familiar tightening in her chest. She took a slow sip of her water, the cool liquid doing little to quell the quiet burn she felt. He truly saw only the surface, never the depth, never the struggle, never the lineage that ran just as deep as his own, albeit without the gilded titles. He spoke with such casual dismissal, so blind to the irony of his own financial plight, so utterly unaware that he was describing the very person at his table. A few guests offered non-committal murmurs, some nodding politely, others avoiding eye contact. Lady Beatrice Covington, however, did not flinch. She sat opposite Eleanor, her silver hair impeccably coiffed, her sharp eyes observing the Duke with an almost scientific interest. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that Eleanor alone seemed to catch. Lady Beatrice knew. Eleanor felt a subtle current pass between them, an unspoken acknowledgement. "It is indeed a curious trend," another guest, a rather portly gentleman named Sir Reginald, ventured, his voice a little hesitant. "One hears tales of fortunes made overnight, of individuals rising from obscurity to acquire considerable holdings. One does wonder about the nature of these new proprietors." The Duke scoffed, a sound that was a little too loud, a little too dismissive for the refined setting. He put down his carving utensils with a decisive clatter. "One wonders indeed, Sir Reginald. Most likely some common upstart, I should think. Perhaps a tradesman who has stumbled upon a lucky invention, or a factory owner who has profited from the sweat of others. They possess no appreciation for heritage, no understanding of the weight of responsibility that comes with land ownership. They merely acquire, as one might acquire a new carriage or a particularly gaudy piece of jewelry." His words, laced with disdain, painted a vivid, if prejudiced, picture of the anonymous buyers. Eleanor's internal world remained calm, yet she felt a quiet fire begin to kindle deep within her. The Duke's arrogance was a constant, predictable force, like the turning of the tides. She had anticipated this, had planned for it, yet hearing his casual contempt for her kind still stung with a faint, residual ache of old wounds. She had worked tirelessly, built an empire brick by painstaking brick, and he dismissed it as mere luck or vulgar opportunism. Lady Beatrice then spoke, her voice clear and carefully modulated, cutting through the Duke's bluster like a finely honed blade. "Perhaps, Duke, you are being a trifle too harsh in your estimations. One hears that some of these new owners possess a remarkable foresight, a rather keen eye for potential, and indeed a profound understanding of how to manage assets that others, perhaps, have allowed to stagnate." Her words hung in the air, a subtle challenge veiled in polite inquiry. Eleanor felt a small, private thrill. Lady Beatrice was setting the stage with exquisite precision. The Duke's good humor, already thin, frayed visibly at Lady Beatrice's interjection. He flushed a deeper shade of crimson. "Stagnate, Lady Beatrice? What an odd choice of word. These lands have been in my family for generations. There is no stagnation, only the steady, dignified continuation of tradition. These newcomers, these blah, industrialists, they come with their new money and their crude ideas, attempting to inject their vulgar efficiency into a system that has proven its worth over centuries. His hand tightened around the stem of his wineglass, his knuckles turning white. Eleanor observed his discomfort, the way his eyes darted around the table, seeking validation for his pronouncements. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, unable to see beyond the narrow confines of his aristocratic world. She imagined the dusty ledgers in her London townhouse, detailing every meticulous transaction, every calculated risk, every hard-won success that had brought her to this very table. Her fortune was not an accident. It was a testament to relentless effort and shrewd intellect. Indeed, Duke, Lady Beatrice continued, unperturbed by his rising indignation, her voice maintaining its calm, measured tone. But even the most venerable traditions require revitalization from time to time, a fresh perspective, perhaps. And one cannot deny the sheer scale of some of these recent transactions. To acquire not just one, but several significant properties suggests an individual of considerable means, and dare I say, considerable strategic acumen. Hardly a common upstart, one would think. Her gaze, for a fleeting moment, met Eleanor's. There was a spark of amusement, a glint of shared understanding that Eleanor returned with a barely perceptible nod. She allowed herself a small, internal smile. Lady Beatrice was playing her role beautifully, expertly fanning the flames of the Duke's arrogance, preparing him for the inevitable conflagration. The air at the table grew heavier, the polite veneer of dinner conversation beginning to crack under the strain of the unspoken. The Duke cleared his throat, a rather theatrical gesture, and took a long, agitated sip of his claret. He slammed the glass down a little too hard on the table. Strategic acumen. For what, pray tell? To strip the land of its resources? To erect unsightly factories where once noble forests stood? These are not acts of acumen, Lady Beatrice, but acts of avarice. They lack the sensitivity, the understanding of the land's spirit that only a true aristocrat, one born to the soil, can possess. He gestured vaguely with his hand, encompassing the manor, the grounds, the very air they breathed. Eleanor felt the chill of the old house settle deeper around her. The Duke's words, though directed at an unknown entity, were a direct assault on her very being, her life's work, her identity. She had acquired Blackwood Manor not to desecrate it, but to restore it, to breathe new life into its crumbling grandeur, to honor its history in a way the Duke, in his neglect and self-indulgence, never could. She remembered her own family's stories, the injustices, the slow, grinding poverty that had stemmed from her ancestors being dispossessed by the very class the Duke so proudly represented. The conversation around the table had largely quieted, the other guests sensing the rising tension between the Duke and Lady Beatrice. Forks scraped less often, and voices lowered to whispers than to silence. All eyes, subtly or overtly, began to turn towards the source of the growing friction. The rich aroma of the dessert, a delicate berry tart, did little to soothe the increasingly strained atmosphere. Lady Beatrice, however, seemed to relish the dramatic pause. She leaned forward slightly, her posture elegant and deliberate, her gaze fixed on the Duke. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer than before, yet it commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. It was a voice that promised revelation, a quiet prelude to a bombshell. Indeed, Duke, she declared, a knowing glint in her eyes, one might make many assumptions about the new owner, based on rumor and conjecture. But one would, I assure you, be quite mistaken in their presumptions. She paused again, drawing out the moment, allowing the full weight of her words to settle into the hushed silence of the dining room. Every guest held their breath, waiting. With a dramatic pause that captures the table's attention, Lady Beatrice leans forward slightly and declares, "Indeed, I happen to know precisely who the new owner is, and you would all be quite surprised." A heavy silence descended upon the grand dining hall. It was thick and suffocating, like the deep burgundy velvet drapes that framed the tall, arched windows. Every eye, moments ago sparkling with polite conversation and the warm, dancing flicker of 100 candles, now fixed with an almost desperate intensity upon Lady Beatrice Covington. The delicate clinking of silver against fine porcelain ceased abruptly. The gentle murmur of voices, once a comforting tide, evaporated completely. Only the soft, rhythmic crackle of the fire in the distant marble hearth remained. It was a lonely, pulsing heartbeat in the sudden void. It felt as if the very air had been drawn from the room, replaced by a sudden, chilling vacuum of expectation. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. The rich scent of roasted fowl and warm spices, which had filled the room with festive cheer, now seemed to hang heavy and unnoticed, overshadowed by the palpable tension. Duke Alistair Blackwood had been leaning back slightly in his ornate, high-backed chair of carved oak and dark leather. A complacent, almost smug smile played on his lips. He felt an unfamiliar prickle of profound unease. It began as a cold knot in his stomach, spreading quickly into a tightness in his chest. He watched Lady Beatrice, his brow furrowing almost imperceptibly, a shallow line appearing between his eyes. Her words from only moments before, hinting at her knowledge of the mysterious new owner of his ancestral lands, echoed sharply in his mind. Something about her tone, a certain knowing glint in her sharp, intelligent eyes, had begun to grate fiercely on his nerves. Alistair hated surprises. He especially disliked any he did not meticulously orchestrate himself. His gaze darted around the long, polished mahogany table, seeking complicity, perhaps a shared amusement, at what he considered Lady Beatrice's tiresome theatricality, but he found only rigid attention. Faces, usually animated with gossip and laughter, were now turned towards her with an almost unnerving, statuesque uniformity. The potent scent of roasted pheasant and the robust bouquet of fine claret, usually so comforting, now seemed to mingle with a faint, almost metallic tang of apprehension that caught in the back of his throat. Lady Beatrice, however, remained utterly serene, an island of calm in the suddenly agitated room. She savored the moment with quiet relish. A small, almost imperceptible curve played on her lips. Her eyes danced with a deep, private amusement. She was a true connoisseur of human drama. This scene was unfolding with an exquisite, almost painful precision. Every subtle reaction was a perfectly played note in her carefully composed, intricate symphony. She held the complete attention of the entire room, a singular power she wielded with an effortless, practiced grace. She relished the palpable weight of every single gaze upon her. The very air around her seemed to shimmer with her quiet authority. Her gaze lingered on the Duke for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, a silent challenge passing between them. Then it swept with deliberate slowness across the faces of the other guests, assessing their shock and anticipation. Finally, her eyes came to rest with careful, unwavering intent upon Eleanor Vance. Eleanor sat perfectly still amidst the sudden, charged quiet. She was a quiet anchor in the suddenly turbulent room. Her posture was straight, her shoulders relaxed, yet held with a subtle strength that belied the inner turmoil. She felt the sudden, dramatic shift in atmosphere. The collective tension was palpable and pressing in on her, like a heavy, unseen blanket. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her, a fleeting shiver that started at the nape of her neck and settled in her stomach. Her hands, however, remained remarkably steady, clasped gently in her lap beneath the cool, smooth linen tablecloth. She could feel the delicate weave of the fabric against her skin. She had waited for this exact moment. She had planned for it with meticulous care. She had endured countless slights and whispers for it. Now it was undeniably here, a silent, relentless clock reaching its appointed, final hour. Her heart beat a slow, deep, measured rhythm against her ribs, a resonant drum announcing an inevitable, profound change. The flickering candlelight danced in the polished silver before her, catching on the curve of a spoon. It reflected tiny, fragmented images of the expectant, distorted faces around the table. She could almost taste the anticipation, sharp and electric, in the air, a metallic tang like a storm approaching. Lady Beatrice then performed a small, elegant gesture with her left hand, a delicate, almost languid movement of her wrist that somehow managed to command even more absolute attention. The subtle gleam of a sapphire ring on her finger caught the candlelight. Her gaze remained firmly fixed on Eleanor. A profound, unspoken communication passed between the two women, a shared secret finally coming to light. The Duke, catching this knowing exchange, felt also a fresh, burning wave of irritation flood through him, heating his ears. Why was Beatrice looking at her? He thought, the question a rasp in his mind. The woman was barely a guest. She was a forgotten cousin twice removed, or so he had vaguely, dismissively assumed upon her arrival. He had actively dismissed her presence since she first entered his manor, mistaking her quiet demeanor for someone utterly beneath his notice, someone unworthy of even a passing glance. And now this grand dame of society, Lady Beatrice herself, was directing the entire spotlight, the focus of the entire room, towards her. It was simply preposterous. It felt like an insult to his very standing. His brow furrowed more deeply, forming a sharp V between his eyes. A small, insistent vein in his temple began to pulse faintly, rhythmically, with his building anger. Then Lady Beatrice's voice, clear and precise, cut through the profound hush. Each carefully articulated word resonated with an almost crystalline clarity in the suddenly cavernous, echoing room. She paused for a deliberate breath, her eyes still holding Eleanor's, before she spoke the words that would shatter the evening's peace. "Why, the new owner of Blackwood Manor and all its surrounding lands," she announced, her tone utterly devoid of any flippancy, but imbued instead with a profound, almost ceremonial gravitas that demanded respect, "is none other than our esteemed guest, Miss Eleanor Vance." Her voice lingered on Eleanor's full name, giving it a weight it had never held before in that house. The words hung in the air, suspended for a breathless, agonizing fraction of a second, as if time itself had momentarily ceased. Then their full, shocking weight crashed down upon the assembled company. It was not a single unified sound that followed, but a swift, stunning cascade of individual, incredulous reactions. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, rippled through the room. It sounded like a sudden gust of wind rustling through dry, brittle leaves in late autumn. It started at one end of the long, gleaming table, a choked, almost incredulous intake of breath from one of the ladies. Then it spread quickly, catching like wildfire across the faces, until every single person in the room seemed to emit a soft, astonished sound of disbelief. Cutlery clattered faintly on one side as a startled hand, belonging to a young gentleman, knocked his silver fork against the edge of his plate. A woman in emerald green silk gasped aloud. Her gloved hand flew to cover her open mouth, her eyes widening in genuine disbelief. Another gentleman, halfway through a sip of his wine, froze utterly. The crystal glass remained halfway to his parched lips. A single dark ruby drop clung precariously to the rim. Every single head in the room swiveled, a synchronized movement of linen and silk. First they turned towards the triumphant Lady Beatrice. Then, as if drawn by some invisible, irresistible string, they turned slowly, inexorably, to stare at Eleanor. Their gazes were no longer polite or idly curious. They were now piercing, sharp, and assessing, filled with a potent mixture of shock, profound confusion, and a dawning, reluctant awe. They scrutinized her from across the vast table. Their eyes raked over her composed demeanor, her simple but elegant gown of soft dove-gray silk. They searched desperately for any sign of the common upstart the Duke had so readily, so confidently dismissed. Instead, Maalim Ayadin, they found only a woman of quiet, undeniable strength. Her posture was regal and poised. Her gaze was steady and utterly unwavering as she met each stare. The silence that followed this collective gasp was even more profound than before. It was a suffocating blanket laced with the heavy, undeniable weight of the unbelievable, shattering truth. Then, inevitably, the gazes shifted again, turning with a collective, silent motion to the Duke. His reaction, or rather his stark, shocking lack of one, was the most dramatic sight of all. He had been holding a half-finished glass of claret. The rich ruby liquid gleamed darkly, almost menacingly in the flickering candlelight. At Lady Beatrice's devastating announcement, his hand, which had been raised casually to his mouth for a leisurely sip, froze mid-motion. It was suspended unnaturally in the air, as if time had stopped for him alone. The delicate, fragile stem of the crystal glass trembled, ever so slightly, in his stiff, white-knuckled grasp. It threatened at any moment to spill its precious contents onto the pristine white tablecloth. His jaw, which had been set in an expression of growing annoyance and disdain just seconds before, now hung slightly agape. He was unable to form even a single coherent word. His lips were parted, but no sound emerged. His face, which moments before had been flushed with wine and a certain smug self-satisfaction, now began to drain of all color with startling speed. It started around his eyes, a faint, sickly pallor spreading outwards, like ink bleeding on a page. His entire countenance became ashen, almost ghostly beneath the flickering, uncertain candlelight. The vibrant blue of his eyes, usually so sharp and disdainful, now seemed clouded. They were dilated with profound shock and an utterly incomprehensible bewilderment. He looked utterly bewildered, lost. It was as if the very foundations of his carefully constructed world had abruptly, violently shifted beneath his feet, leaving him utterly suspended in an impossible, terrifying void. His gaze, fixed with a desperate, unblinking intensity on Eleanor Vance, was no longer dismissive or merely irritated. It was raw, uncomprehending, and utterly, terribly speechless, holding a depth of dawning terror. The claret glass trembled in Duke Alistair Blackwood's hand, a ruby bead of wine clinging precariously to the rim. His face, moments ago flushed with good cheer, had become a canvas of disbelief, utterly devoid of color. The sudden pronouncement from Lady Beatrice had ripped the celebratory air from the dining hall, replacing it with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every soul present. His eyes, usually filled with an imperious glint, now darted between Lady Beatrice and Eleanor Vance, seeking some sign, any sign, that this was merely an elaborate, ill-conceived joke. What is this, Beatrice?" His voice, when it finally emerged, was a strained whisper, barely audible above the sudden collective intake of breath from the assembled guests. He tried to force a laugh, a brittle, humorless sound that died quickly in the tense atmosphere. "A jest, surely, a cruel, untimely jest." He looked at Eleanor, his gaze a mixture of confusion and insult, unable to reconcile the poised woman at the table with the image of a servant he held in his mind. The thought was absurd, preposterous, an affront to his very being. Eleanor remained motionless, her posture perfectly straight, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Her dark eyes, clear and unwavering, held the Duke's whim, allowing the accusation and the desperate plea in his voice to wash over her without reaction. She tasted the lingering richness of the roasted duck on her tongue, but her senses were entirely focused on the slow, agonizing unraveling of the man before her. This was the moment she had patiently cultivated, a seed of truth now blossoming into a bitter harvest for him. She would not rush it. The full weight of his arrogance, the casual disdain he had shown, deserved to be measured in every agonizing second of his dawning comprehension. Lady Beatrice, however, did not waver. She met the Duke's incredulous stare with a calm, almost pitying expression. "Alistair," she said, her voice gentle but firm, carrying effortlessly across the hushed room, "there is no jest. Miss Vance purchased Blackwood Manor and its lands a fortnight ago. The transaction was finalized last Tuesday." She paused, allowing the precise, damning details to sink in. "I thought you would wish to know the identity of your new landlord." A ripple of murmurs, hushed and astonished, spread through the room like a sudden breeze rustling dry leaves. Forks clinked against plates in isolated, accidental movements. The Duke's jaw worked, struggling to form words that refused to come. He shook his head slowly, denial etched deep into every line of his face. "Impossible," he finally managed, his voice louder now, laced with a desperate, frantic edge. "My solicitors, they would have informed me. This cannot be true. You are mistaken, Beatrice. Terribly mistaken." He slammed the claret glass onto the polished table, the sharp clink echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. A few drops of wine splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, staining it like fresh blood. He ignored it, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, searching for some loophole, some contradiction in her composed demeanor. Eleanor still said nothing, her stillness a powerful counterpoint to his escalating agitation. She watched the subtle tremors that began to run through his hand, the one that had so casually dismissed her with his heavy coat just hours earlier. She felt the cool air of the high-ceilinged room on her skin, the subtle scent of beeswax and old timber that permeated the manor. Each detail was a thread in the tapestry of his downfall, and she was an unmoving observer, allowing him to weave his own tapestry of despair. She thought of her family, generations past, who had felt the sharp edge of his ancestors' disdain, and a cold satisfaction settled in her heart. The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces a mixture of shock, fascination, and profound embarrassment. A young woman near the end of the table dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, her eyes wide. A portly gentleman cleared his throat, then seemed to think better of it, sinking lower in his chair. No one dared to speak, to offer comfort, or to challenge Lady Beatrice's declaration. Her reputation for unflinching honesty, combined with the stony silence of Eleanor Vance, lent an undeniable gravity to her words. The air grew heavier, thick with unspoken questions and the palpable tension of a world suddenly turned upside down. Alistair Blackwood's eyes narrowed, a frantic, almost animalistic glint replacing the aristocratic disdain. He looked around the room, meeting the averted gazes of his friends, his neighbors, his supposed peers. He saw not sympathy but an awkward witnessing, a confirmation of the unthinkable. The silence of the room was not merely an absence of sound. It was an affirmation, a collective nod to the truth Lady Beatrice had just unveiled. He began to sweat, a cold dampness prickling his hairline. The finely tailored silk waistcoat felt suddenly too tight, constricting his breathing. His mind, initially clouded by fury and disbelief, began to make horrifying connections. The strange, quiet woman who had arrived as a guest of honor, the knowing looks from Lady Beatrice, the subtle, almost imperceptible changes around the manor that had begun in recent weeks, dismissed as minor repairs. And then, the memory, sharp and vivid, of the dark charcoal coat, the soft wool, the elegant buttons. Her hands, firm and cool, as they took it from him. He saw it all again, the casual dismissal, the utter condescension he had shown her, the words he had uttered, "Take this to the cloakroom if you please, and mind you don't crease it." Alistair's breath hitched, a gasp trapped in his throat. The impossible, the unthinkable was slowly, excruciatingly coalescing into a terrifying reality. This woman, this quiet, unassuming woman he had treated like a servant, was the very person who now owned his ancestral home. The blood drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin stretched and pale over his prominent cheekbones. His haughty posture, once so rigid, began to slump, a visible collapse of his carefully constructed world. He looked at Eleanor again, his eyes wide with a dawning horror, seeing her not as a nameless guest, but as an avenging figure, a quiet force of nature he had foolishly underestimated. He tried to speak again, but only a dry rasp escaped his throat. The words caught, tangled with the sudden, overwhelming shame that washed over him. The heat of humiliation crept up his neck, burning his ears despite the cold sweat. He felt as though every eye in the room was a searing brand, marking him, searing the truth of his foolishness and his financial ruin into his very soul. The elegant chandeliers, usually a source of soft light, now seemed to glare down at him, illuminating his every weakness. The scent of fine food, once so appealing, now turned his stomach, a bitter taste rising in his mouth. Eleanor watched him, her expression still unreadable, her gaze steady. She felt the surge of his anguish, the raw, visceral pain of a man watching his world crumble around him. It was not triumph, not exactly, but a deep, quiet validation. This was the consequence of his actions, his blind pride, his casual cruelty. The silence stretched on, a vast, echoing chasm that seemed to swallow all sound, leaving only the thunderous beating of the Duke's own heart and the cold, unyielding truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eleanor broke the spell. Her voice, calm and firm, cut through the heavy air with the precision of a surgeon's blade. It was not loud, but it resonated with an undeniable authority that commanded immediate attention, silencing the last vestiges of murmuring. "Lady Beatrice speaks the truth, Duke," Eleanor said, her dark eyes still fixed on his, holding him captive. "Blackwood Manor is now legally mine." A cold tremor ran through Duke Alistair Blackwood. The truth in Eleanor's eyes cut deeper than any blade, even as claret sloshed in his glass. His breath hitched, a sound lost in the sudden silence. He wanted to scream, to deny everything, but words withered. He could only stare, silently begging her to call it a cruel jest. Eleanor Vance watched him, her gaze unwavering, devoid of triumph or malice. She was a quiet force, now unleashed. Candlelight softened her face, yet could not hide the steady resolve in her eyes. She placed her linen napkin precisely beside her plate, a meticulous gesture matching her words. A faint rosewater scent clung to her, a delicate contrast to the rich dinner aroma. "This is no sudden acquisition, Duke," Eleanor began, her voice measured in the stunning room. Each word held authority. "My interest in Blackwood Manor and its properties has been long-standing." She spoke with absolute composure, her intellect shining through. She leaned forward. "I recognized its potential, even in its considerable disrepair." Her clinical description struck Alistair. Shame burned his neck. The faded tapestries and chipped gilding confirmed her assessment. "My team began analysis over 3 years ago," she continued. "We monitored the market, the economy, and your family's increasing public financial disclosures. Everyone knew the Blackwood name meant mounting debt." Alistair's stomach churned, the fine food threatening revolt. He tried to speak, a weak protest, but no sound emerged. His throat felt tight. The dining room air, once jovial, now suffocated him. Guests exchanged quick, furtive glances, each one a jab to his crumbling pride. Eleanor's gaze returned to Alistair. The estate, Duke, was marketed discreetly but persistently. Debts were too vast to ignore. Creditors, as you know, grew quite insistent. Her factual tone carried an underlying inevitability. He remembered endless letters, terse lawyer meetings, and desperate loan attempts against over-leveraged assets. He had dismissed them, clinging to the belief Blackwood's name alone would conjure miracles. Hearing it laid bare by this woman, the stranger he insulted, felt like a public autopsy of his life. "The opportunity arose," Eleanor stated, drawing every soul's attention. "Not through predatory design, but from your family's genuine necessity. Blackwood Manor and its ancestral lands were offered to many buyers. My offer simply proved the most comprehensive and the most solvent." Lady Beatrice Covington, silently observant, offered a faint nod. Her intelligent eyes sparkled, understanding Eleanor's masterful dismantling of the Duke's world. She had seen countless fortunes fall, but rarely with such quiet precision. Cold sweat pricked Alistair's skin. He remembered his earlier dismissive remarks about new money. His own words now echoed as cruel self-judgment. The silver on the table reflected his pale, horrified face. Eleanor continued, "My business philosophy is responsible stewardship. I invest in assets with genuine heritage, but which have suffered from a lack of attentive management." That phrase hung in the air, a polite but devastating indictment of Alistair's tenure. He remembered the leaky roof, the crumbling stable block, fields lying fallow. Each neglected corner now witnessed against him, confirming her accusations. The scent of old books, usually comforting, now mocked his decay. "My family's history, Duke," Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly, "taught me the value of land. It taught the devastating cost of its loss from indifference or mismanagement." Her gaze held his. Alistair felt a chill, a terrible understanding that her words carried more than financial implications. He searched his memory for the Vance name, linked to families his ancestors had wronged. Blackwoods had a long history of aggressive land acquisition. A knot of dread tightened in his gut. Was this more than business? Was it slow-burning retribution? Whispers rippled around the table, growing in volume. Guests leaned together, faces shocked. "She bought it?" one lady murmured. "All of it?" another asked, eyes wide. Thomas, a portly gentleman, cleared his throat. "Alistair, those grand plans for Blackwood, the revitalization you spoke of, were they only dreams?" His voice, though not unkind, cut Alistair to the bone with disappointment. Alistair's jaw clenched. He wanted to lash out, to defend himself, but his words felt hollow, meaningless against Eleanor's undeniable truth. He tasted bitter irony, the metallic tang of failed ambitions. The wine meant to impress tasted like ashes. Eleanor remained calm, letting the murmurs subside. My decision for Blackwood Manor was driven by economic rationale and a sense of responsibility. She chose her words with surgical precision, avoiding vendetta, yet her meaning was clear. She saw herself restoring what he had allowed to wither. The estate shows considerable neglect, she elaborated, scanning the high ceilings. It requires significant investment, not merely to maintain, but to restore its grandeur and secure its future viability. Her assessment was undeniable. The grandeur Alistair clung to was a faded memory. He felt the weight of every creaking floorboard, every peeling flake of paint, every cold draft. These were not just flaws. They were symbols of his failure, his indolence, his disregard for the legacy he should protect. The silence after her words was deafening, broken only by the hearth's faint crackle. Sarah, a younger guest, spoke respectfully. Miss Vance, then you intend to breathe new life into Blackwood? To truly bring it back? Her question held a genuine hope Alistair had long abandoned. Eleanor offered a small, polite smile. Precisely, not just a preserved relic, but a thriving, sustainable enterprise, benefiting the surrounding community as well. She painted a future Alistair had only dimly imagined, too proud and incompetent to pursue. Respect for Eleanor filled the room, admiration washing over the initial shock. Guests now saw not just a wealthy businesswoman, but a visionary. Her quiet power revealed itself through undeniable fact and composed dignity. Alistair watched them, his world dissolving. The deference, the polite smiles, the veiled contempt he had so often received had shifted. He was now an object of pity, a fallen monarch in his crumbling kingdom. The air, once rich with his supposed domain, carried the bitter tang of his defeat. His gaze fell upon Eleanor again. Her dark hair, simply styled, framed unshakable resolve. He remembered his heavy wool coat in her hands, the brief brush of her fingers. He had seen only a servant, an inferior, blinded by colossal arrogance. Humiliation became a physical ache, a searing pain in his chest. It was not just the loss of the manor, the lands, the family legacy. It was the crushing realization that he had been utterly blind, foolish, contemptible. Duke Alistair Blackwood was exposed as a hollow man, a charlatan, in his own dining hall. His hands slid from the table edge to his lap. He felt clammy, his skin cold. A single tear, born of shame and despair, traced his cheek like a branding iron. He could not meet Eleanor's steady gaze, the woman he had so profoundly underestimated. He needed to escape, to flee this tableau of his undoing. The polished wood, the silver, the faces of his guests all pressed in, amplifying his torment. He felt a desperate urge to rip off his stifling cravat, to tear at his expensive coat. With a sudden, violent motion, Duke Alistair Blackwood shoved his chair back. It scraped loudly against the polished floor, shattering the delicate quiet. That ugly, desperate noise reflected the turmoil raging within him. He stood abruptly, body trembling, his face a mask of profound humiliation and dawning despair. He could no longer meet Eleanor's gaze. Alistair Blackwood's world had just fractured, yet some stubborn part of him still clung to the shards of his dignity. His chair scraped back with a violent sound against the polished floor, a raw, grating protest echoing through the suddenly heavy silence of the dining room. His eyes, clouded with a desperate, burning shame, darted from Eleanor's unflinching gaze to the faces of his guests, searching for a single ally, a hint of support, anything but the judgment he saw reflected there. He found nothing but averted eyes and expressions ranging from polite embarrassment to outright pity. The air in the room thickened, pressing in on him, making every breath a struggle. He could feel the blood thrumming in his temples, a furious, hot pulse that threatened to burst. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and constricted, tasting the bitter ash of his crumbling pride. He had to say something, anything, to reclaim some small measure of control over this rapidly unraveling disaster. His gaze snagged on Eleanor again, her posture poised, her expression a careful mask of calm. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, undeniable authority that infuriated him more than any open gloating ever could. He saw the subtle curve of her lips, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt that felt like a silent, mocking smile. His jaw tightened. He would not let her win so completely. He would not let her stand there, serene and victorious, while his life imploded around him. A forced, hollow laugh escaped him, rattling in his chest. Vulgar opportunism, he managed, the words laced with a contempt he hoped would sting her, would wound her composure. He tried to infuse his voice with his usual aristocratic disdain, to project an air of superiority that no longer truly belonged to him. The phrase hung in the air, a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim the moral high ground, to paint her as something less, something common. He could feel the heat rising in his face, a burning flush that crept up his neck and settled behind his ears. His hands resting on the table felt clammy and unsteady. He clenched them into fists beneath the linen cloth, digging his fingernails into his palms, trying to ground himself. He continued, his voice wavering, attempting to regain its former resonance. To prey upon a family's misfortunes, to buy up legacies with mere coin. The words felt clumsy on his tongue, hollow and without substance. He meant for them to sound scathing, to cut her down, but they emerged as brittle and weak, a mere whisper of his former arrogance. The grand, old words he typically used to dismiss those he considered beneath him now sounded like a child's petulant complaints. The carefully constructed facade of his aristocratic superiority was cracking, revealing the raw, frightened man beneath. His voice cracked audibly on the final word, a thin, reedy sound that betrayed his desperate vulnerability. He felt a tremor run through him, a shiver that was not from cold, but from the profound chill of his own humiliation. The sound of his own breaking voice was louder than any of the murmurs around the table, a single pointed clearing of a throat sliced through the fragile silence that followed his broken words. Lady Beatrice Covington, seated directly opposite Eleanor, straightened in her chair, her gaze fixed on the Duke with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor accusatory, but simply knowing, a quiet judgment that seemed to weigh heavily on the air. The small, almost imperceptible sound was enough. It was a subtle yet devastating repudiation of his desperate outburst. It was a clear signal that his words held no sway, no power, no shred of dignity left to them. The sound seemed to resonate in his very bones, a final, definitive pronouncement of his downfall. He watched as guests around the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes skittering away from his, finding sudden, intense interest in their untouched desserts, the patterns on the wallpaper, or the distant flicker of candlelight. No one met his gaze. No one dared to offer him even a glance of mock solidarity. Their faces were a blur of polite indifference, a collective withdrawal that felt more isolating than any open hostility. He saw a man, Mr. Henderson, whose family had owed his for generations, discreetly exchange a glance with his wife, a look of profound awkwardness and perhaps even a flicker of relief that the tables had finally turned. Across the table, Mrs. Davies, who always flattered him, now fussed with her napkin, her face a mask of careful neutrality. The silver cutlery, which had once felt like an extension of his own grandeur, now seemed to mock him, reflecting the distorted image of his own despair. Each averted glance was a fresh stab, each silent moment a new layer of shame settling upon his shoulders. The scent of roasted pheasant, once a comforting aroma, now seemed cloying and sickening. He felt a prickle behind his eyes, a stinging sensation that threatened to bring forth tears, but he fought them back fiercely, unwilling to grant anyone the satisfaction of seeing him weep. Not yet. He tasted bile at the back of his throat, the bitter tang of defeat. The ornate plasterwork on the ceiling, which he had so often admired, now seemed to press down on him, suffocating him with the weight of generations of Blackwood pride. He looked at Eleanor again, her face still composed, her eyes steady. There was no hint of personal malice, no crude satisfaction, only a quiet, resolute presence that spoke of unwavering strength. It was this very lack of overt emotion, this cool, collected demeanor, That was perhaps the most crushing blow of all. She had won, decisively and completely, without resorting to the base emotions he now felt consuming him. She merely existed, a serene, implacable force that had quietly, systematically dismantled his entire world. The thought was a searing brand in his mind, burning away the last vestiges of his self-delusion. The silence grew, stretching taut and thin, threatening to snap. It was not a comfortable silence, but one thick with unspoken judgment, with the hushed understanding of his complete and utter ruin. He could hear his own ragged breathing loud and desperate in his ears, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird trying to escape. The humiliation was a physical entity, a crushing weight that bore down on him, stealing his breath, blurring his vision. Every fiber of his being screamed for escape, for release from this unbearable scrutiny. He felt his hands tremble uncontrollably, the fine china on the table blurring before his eyes. The light from the candelabras, once warm and inviting, now seemed harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every flaw, every tremor. He tried to stand, to push himself up from the table, but his legs felt like lead. He felt trapped, pinned beneath the collective gaze of his guests, even though most of them were now pointedly looking elsewhere. The velvet of his chair, once a symbol of his comfort and status, now felt like a prison, holding him fast. He was acutely aware of the rich fabrics of his suit, the expensive cut of his waistcoat, which now felt like a costume, an absurd masquerade for a man who had nothing left. The faint scent of cigar smoke from earlier in the evening seemed to cling to his clothes, a ghost of the false confidence he had projected. His mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of accusations and regrets. He saw the faces of his ancestors in his mind's eye, stern and disapproving, judging his failure, his monumental collapse. The grandeur of Blackwood Manor, the very walls around him, seemed to mock his fallen state. This was his home, his birthright, his legacy, and now it was gone, swallowed whole by the quiet woman he had so arrogantly dismissed. The reality of it slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. Blackwood Manor was hers. The realization was a cold, stark horror, freezing the last drop of defiance in his veins. The weight of generations of expectation, of family honor, now crashed down upon him. He had squandered it all, lost everything, not in a grand battle or a heroic sacrifice, but through sheer, ignorant arrogance. He pictured his father's stern face, the deep lines etched with the responsibility of upholding their name. How would his father have looked at him now? With utter contempt, he knew. The thought was unbearable, a sharp pain in his chest. His own self-loathing curdled in his stomach, a bitter, acidic sensation. He had thought himself untouchable, above the petty concerns of commerce, insulated by his name and his heritage. He had been so wrong. The truth, stark and brutal, now lay exposed for all to see. He had been a fool, a pompous, blind fool, and everyone in this room knew it. The very air seemed to hum with their silent judgment, their unspoken disdain. The urge to flee became an overwhelming primal instinct. He had to get out, to escape the suffocating weight of their pity, their hidden smiles of satisfaction, their silent condemnations. He could no longer bear the heat of his own burning cheeks, the clamminess of his hands, the dryness in his mouth. He needed air, space, a place where he could hide from the crushing reality of his public humiliation. The noise of his own blood rushing in his ears drowned out any other sound. He could not stay there, a spectacle of his own undoing, a broken man on display for the amusement of his former peers. With a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, he pushed himself away from the table once more. The chair shrieked against the floorboards, a jarring, ugly sound that cut through the lingering silence like a knife. His movement was clumsy, uncoordinated, a stark contrast to his usual graceful, assured manner. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of the table, his hand brushing against a crystal decanter. He felt the cold, hard glass against his fingers, a fleeting sensation before he pulled away. He did not look back. He could not. His eyes were fixed on the double doors of the dining room, a beacon of escape in his shattered world. He moved with a desperate urgency, his long legs carrying him quickly across the vast expanse of the dining room. Each step felt heavy, each movement awkward, as if his body were no longer truly his own. He heard a soft rustle of silk as he passed a group of ladies, a faint whisper that might have been his name, or simply the sound of their startled reactions. He pushed through the doors, not bothering to open them gently, feeling the heavy wood swing wide with a resounding thud that echoed behind him. He vanished into the darkened hallway, leaving behind the stunned silence of the dining room, a void where his presence had once commanded the utmost deference. A chilling quiet settled over the grand dining room, a thick blanket woven from the Duke's abrupt departure. The sound of his chair scraping against the polished floorboards still echoed in the corners of the room, a raw, jagged edge that lingered in the air. Eleanor Vance remained seated, perfectly poised, her hands resting calmly on the white linen tablecloth. She felt the sudden vacuum he left behind, a space once filled with his bluster and arrogance, now empty and echoing with unspoken truths. Across from her, Lady Beatrice offered a subtle, knowing smile, a slight tilt of her head that spoke volumes without a single word. It was a gesture of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of a long-awaited moment finally arriving. Eleanor met her gaze, a faint warmth stirring within her at the older woman's quiet support. She could hear the hushed whispers beginning to ripple through the tables, like a gentle current slowly gathering strength. A few moments later, a middle-aged gentleman from a neighboring estate, Mr. Davies, cleared his throat delicately. He leaned slightly towards Eleanor, his voice carefully modulated, low enough to be discreet but clear enough to carry. He offered his congratulations, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. Eleanor gave him a composed nod, a small, polite smile playing on her lips. She could feel the lingering warmth of the untouched silver fork against her fingertips, a cool, smooth comfort amidst the sudden shift in atmosphere. Another guest, a lady Eleanor recognized from London's social circuit, approached her table. Her voice, usually sharp and critical, was softened by a newfound respect. "Miss Vance, a most impressive revelation," she murmured, her gaze lingering on Eleanor with an almost deferential quality. "To have acquired such an estate with such discretion." Eleanor simply thanked her, a quiet dignity in her response that left no room for further questioning. The scent of roasted meats and rich sauces, once a backdrop to the Duke's loud pronouncements, now seemed to hang heavy, almost stifling in its intensity. Eleanor observed the faces around her, their initial stunned disbelief slowly giving way to various shades of curiosity, respect, and perhaps a touch of apprehension. Some guests looked at her with newfound deference, while others seemed almost fearful, as if her quiet power had finally manifested itself in a way they could no longer ignore. She could feel the subtle shift in their collective energy, the way their eyes now sought her out, seeking an explanation, a signal, anything to make sense of the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. A wave of profound satisfaction washed over Eleanor, deep and resonant, like a low hum beneath the surface of her calm exterior. It was not a triumphant roar, but a quiet, steady current that flowed through her veins. This moment, this precise confluence of events, had been meticulously planned, painstakingly executed over years of relentless effort. She thought back to the initial spark, the casual, dismissive tone in the Duke's voice when he had handed her his coat, mistaking her for a mere servant. The memory of that heavy wool, the faint scent of stale cologne and entitlement, Sonan, still clung to her senses, a potent reminder of the insult. Each slight, each condescending remark, each moment of his willful ignorance had been a small brick in the foundation of her resolve. She remembered the gnawing frustration, the quiet fury that had simmered beneath her composed facade, fueling her determination to not just succeed, but to reclaim what she felt was justly hers. This was more than a business acquisition. It was the culmination of a long personal journey, a redress of old wrongs that stretched back generations. The crispness of the white napkin under her hand felt substantial, a tangible connection to the present moment, anchoring her thoughts. Yet beneath this profound satisfaction, a surprising, almost unwelcome pang of sorrow pricked at her. It was not for the Duke himself, not for his specific suffering, for his arrogance had earned him little genuine sympathy. Instead, it was a sorrow for the utter devastation she had wrought upon a man, regardless of his faults. She saw the raw shame in his eyes just before he fled, The complete collapse of his world in that single public instant. It reminded her of the fragility of even the most deeply entrenched power, how easily it could crumble when its foundations were weak. She knew the feeling of being stripped but honored, of having one's dignity torn away. Though her circumstances had been different, the core human experience of profound loss and humiliation resonated within her. There was a cold, hard truth in witnessing such a complete undoing, a reminder that even justice, when served, could leave wreckage in its wake. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the polished silver and crystal, mirroring the complex interplay of light and shadow within her own heart. Her gaze drifted towards the empty seat where the Duke had sat, the half-empty wine glass, the perfectly folded napkin. He had been so utterly blind, so consumed by his own self-importance, that he had missed every signal, every subtle hint of his impending downfall. He had clung to the illusion of his ancestral right with a desperate grip, even as the walls of his reality crumbled around him. This sorrow was a quiet acknowledgement of the human condition, the tragic flaw that allowed pride to eclipse all reason. Eleanor thought of the long, difficult path that had led her to this very table, in this very room, at this pivotal moment. She remembered the early mornings spent poring over ledgers, the late nights negotiating deals, the countless sacrifices of personal comfort and ease. There had been moments of profound loneliness, moments when the weight of her ambition felt almost unbearable. She had faced skepticism, condescension, and outright dismissal from a world that preferred women to remain in the shadows, particularly in the cutthroat realm of business. Each challenge had hardened her resolve, sharpening her intellect and steeling her will. She had learned to navigate the complex currents of commerce and society with a quiet tenacity, always observing, always learning, always planning. Her ambition was not merely for wealth, but for agency, for respect, for the power to shape her own destiny, and perhaps to right historical wrongs. The cool air of the room, once filled with the warmth of many voices, now felt strangely crisp against her skin, an invigorating chill. She recalled the countless hours spent researching the Blackwood estate, tracing its convoluted lineage and its ever-deepening financial woes. It was a meticulous, almost obsessive endeavor, driven by a blend of calculated business sense and a deeply personal motivation. The land held more than just monetary value for her. It represented a connection to her own past, a symbolic return to a place from which her ancestors had been unjustly displaced. This victory was a reclamation, a quiet but powerful statement that the old order was changing, irrevocably. The personal cost had been substantial. Relationships had been strained, leisure time sacrificed, and a certain innocence, perhaps, had been lost along the way. To achieve such a monumental goal, one had to cultivate a ruthless efficiency, a detachment that allowed for difficult decisions. She wondered briefly if the woman who had first received the Duke's coat, bristling with indignation, was entirely the same as the woman now sitting at this table, outwardly composed, inwardly complex. The scent of beeswax and old paper from the manor's library carried on the air, subtly mingled with the fading smell of dinner, a potent blend of past and present. But there was no turning back now. The die was cast, the truth revealed, and the consequences laid bare. The room still buzzed with muted conversations, the clinking of glasses now sounding more deliberate, more significant. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet strength that settled deep within her. The game had been played, the victory secured, but the story was far from over. This was merely the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another, perhaps even more challenging. She thought of the manor itself, the grand old house that now belonged to her. It was a place steeped in history, both beautiful and decaying, a physical manifestation of the Duke's neglect and her own ambitious vision. She saw past the dust in the fading grandeur, imagining the vibrant life she intended to breathe back into its ancient stones. It would be a testament to hard work, to foresight, to a new era. The subtle hum of distant city life, a sound that she usually found comforting, now seemed to be a quiet reminder of the world beyond these walls, waiting for her return. Her thoughts drifted to the future, to the monumental task of restoring Blackwood Manor, of reshaping its legacy. It would require immense dedication, shrewd investment, and an unwavering hand. She was ready for it. The sorrow she felt for the Duke was a fleeting shadow, quickly overshadowed by the immense responsibility and exhilarating challenge that lay ahead. It was a reminder that even in victory, there were shades of gray, but it did not diminish the righteousness of her cause. Eleanor slowly pushed her chair back, a quiet scraping sound that was far more deliberate, far more controlled than the Duke's frantic exit. Heads turned towards her, a ripple of expectation passing through the remaining guests. She offered a small, polite nod to the room, her gaze sweeping over the faces, acknowledging their presence without inviting further discussion. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipating her next move. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, held a quiet determination. She knew precisely where she needed to go, what remained to be done. There was a final conversation that awaited her, a private confrontation that would seal the fate of Blackwood Manor and perhaps provide some measure of closure for both herself and the broken Duke. Without a word, she turned from the table, her elegant silhouette moving gracefully through the lingering candlelight in hushed whispers. Eleanor walked with a deliberate pace, her posture erect, her gaze fixed. She moved towards the grand oak doors at the far end of the dining room, the path to the Duke's private study already clear in her mind. Each step was firm, resolute, a testament to the journey that had brought her here and the purpose that now guided her. She knew a final private confrontation awaited. A chilling quiet settled over the grand dining room, a thick blanket woven from the Duke's abrupt departure. The sound of his chair scraping against the polished floorboards still echoed in the corners of the room, a raw, jagged edge that lingered in the air. Eleanor Vance remained seated, perfectly poised, her hands resting calmly on the white linen tablecloth. She felt the sudden vacuum he left behind, a space once filled with his bluster and arrogance, now empty and echoing with unspoken truths. Across from her, Lady Beatrice offered a subtle, knowing smile, a slight tilt of her head that spoke volumes without a single word. It was a gesture of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of a long-awaited moment finally arriving. Eleanor met her gaze, a faint warmth stirring within her at the older woman's quiet support. She could hear the hushed whispers beginning to ripple through the tables like a gentle current slowly gathering strength. A few moments later, a middle-aged gentleman from a neighboring estate, Mr. Davies, cleared his throat delicately. He leaned slightly toward Eleanor, his voice carefully modulated, low enough to be discreet but clear enough to carry. He offered his congratulations, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. Eleanor gave him a composed nod, a small, polite smile playing on her lips. She could feel the lingering coolness of the untouched silver fork against her fingertips, a smooth comfort amidst the sudden shift in atmosphere. Another guest, a lady Eleanor recognized from London's social circuit, approached her table. Her voice, usually sharp and critical, was softened by a newfound respect. "Miss Vance, a most impressive revelation," she murmured, her gaze lingering on Eleanor with an almost deferential quality. "To have acquired such an estate with such discretion." Eleanor simply thanked her, a quiet dignity in her response that left no room for further questioning. The scent of roasted meats and rich sauces, once a backdrop to the Duke's loud pronouncements, now seemed to hang heavy, almost stifling in its intensity. Eleanor observed the faces around her, their initial stunned disbelief slowly giving way to various shades of curiosity, respect, and perhaps a touch of apprehension. Some guests looked at her with newfound deference, while others seemed almost fearful, as if her quiet power had finally manifested itself in a way they could no longer ignore. She could feel the subtle shift in their collective energy, the way their eyes now sought her out, seeking an explanation, a signal, anything to make sense of the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. A wave of profound satisfaction washed over Eleanor, deep and resonant, like a low hum beneath the surface of her calm exterior. It was not a triumphant roar, but a quiet, steady current that flowed through her veins. This moment, this precise confluence of events, had been meticulously planned, painstakingly executed over years of relentless effort. She thought back to the initial spark, the casual, dismissive tone in the Duke's voice when he had handed her his coat, mistaking her for a mere servant. The memory of that heavy wool, the faint scent of stale cologne and entitlement, still clung to her senses, a potent reminder of the insult. Each slight, each condescending remark, each moment of his willful ignorance had been a small brick in the foundation of her resolve. She remembered the gnawing frustration, the quiet fury that had simmered beneath her composed facade, fueling her determination to not just succeed, but to reclaim what she felt was justly hers. This was more than a business acquisition. It was the culmination of a long personal journey, a redress of old wrongs that stretched back generations. The crispness of the white napkin under her hand felt substantial, a tangible connection to the present moment, anchoring her thoughts. Yet, beneath this profound satisfaction, a surprising, almost unwelcome pang of sorrow pricked at her. It was not for the Duke himself, not for his specific suffering, for his arrogance had earned him little genuine sympathy. Instead, it was a sorrow for the utter devastation she had wrought upon a man, regardless of his faults. She saw the raw shame in his eyes just before he fled, the complete collapse of his world in that single public instant. It reminded her of the fragility of even the most deeply entrenched power, how easily it could crumble when its foundations were weak. She knew the feeling of being stripped bare, of having one's dignity torn away. Though her circumstances had been different, the core human experience of profound loss and humiliation resonated within her. There was a cold, hard truth in witnessing such a complete undoing, a reminder that even justice, when served, could leave wreckage in its wake. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the polished silver and crystal, mirroring the complex interplay of light and shadow within her own heart. Her gaze drifted towards the empty seat where the Duke had sat, the half-empty wine glass, the perfectly folded napkin. He had been so utterly blind, so consumed by his own self-importance, that he had missed every signal, every subtle hint of his impending downfall. He had clung to the illusion of his ancestral right with a desperate grip, even as the walls of his reality crumbled around him. This sorrow was a quiet acknowledgement of the human condition, the tragic flaw that allowed pride to eclipse all reason. Eleanor thought of the long, difficult path that had led her to this very table, in this very room, at this pivotal moment. She remembered the early mornings spent poring over ledgers, the late nights negotiating deals, the countless sacrifices of personal comfort and ease. There had been moments of profound loneliness, moments when the weight of her ambition felt almost unbearable. She had faced skepticism, condescension, and outright dismissal from a world that preferred women to remain in the shadows, particularly in the cutthroat realm of business. Each challenge had hardened her resolve, sharpening her intellect and steeling her will. She had learned to navigate the complex currents of commerce and society with a quiet tenacity, always observing, always learning, always planning. Her ambition was not merely for wealth, but for agency, for respect, for the power to shape her own destiny, and perhaps to right historical wrongs. The cool air of the room, once filled with the warmth of many voices, now felt strangely crisp against her skin, an invigorating chill. She recalled the countless hours spent researching the Blackwood estate, tracing its convoluted lineage and its ever-deepening financial woes. It was a meticulous, almost obsessive endeavor, driven by a blend of calculated business sense and a deeply personal motivation. The land held more than just monetary value for her. It represented a connection to her own past, a symbolic return to a place from which her ancestors had been unjustly displaced. This victory was a reclamation, a quiet but powerful statement that the old order was changing, irrevocably. The personal cost had been substantial. Relationships had been strained, leisure time sacrificed, and a certain innocence, perhaps, had been lost along the way. To achieve such a monumental goal, one had to cultivate a ruthless efficiency, a detachment that allowed for difficult decisions. She wondered briefly if the woman who had first received the Duke's coat, bristling with indignation, was entirely the same as the woman now sitting at this table, outwardly composed, inwardly complex. The scent of beeswax and old paper from the manor's library carried on the air, subtly mingled with the fading smell of dinner, a potent blend of past and present. But there was no turning back now. The die was cast, the truth revealed, and the consequences laid bare. The room still buzzed with muted conversations, the clinking of glasses now sounding more deliberate, more significant. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet strength that settled deep within her. The game had been played, the victory secured, but the story was far from over. This was merely the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, perhaps even more challenging. She thought of the manor itself, the grand old house that now belonged to her. It was a place steeped in history, both beautiful and decaying, a physical manifestation of the Duke's neglect and her own ambitious vision. She saw past the dust and the fading grandeur, imagining the vibrant life she intended to breathe back into its ancient stones. It would be a testament to hard work, to foresight, to a new era. The subtle hum of distant city life, a sound that she usually found comforting, now seemed to be a quiet reminder of the world beyond these walls, waiting for her return. Her thoughts drifted to the future, to the monumental task of restoring Blackwood Manor, of reshaping its legacy. It would require immense dedication, shrewd investment, and an unwavering hand. She was ready for it. The sorrow she felt for the Duke was a fleeting shadow, quickly overshadowed by the immense responsibility and exhilarating challenge that lay ahead. It was a reminder that even in victory, there were shades of gray, but it did not diminish the righteousness of her cause. Eleanor slowly pushed her chair back, a quiet scraping sound that was far more deliberate, far more controlled than the Duke's frantic exit. Heads turned towards her, a ripple of expectation passing through the remaining guests. She offered a small, polite nod to the room, her gaze sweeping over the faces, acknowledging their presence without inviting further discussion. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipating her next move. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, held a quiet determination. She knew precisely where she needed to go, what remained to be done. There was a final conversation that awaited her, a private confrontation that would seal the fate of Blackwood Manor and perhaps provide some measure of closure for both herself and the broken Duke. Without a word, she turned from the table, her elegant silhouette moving gracefully through the lingering candlelight in hushed whispers. Eleanor walked with a deliberate pace, her posture erect, her gaze fixed. She moved towards the grand oak doors at the far end of the dining room, the path to the Duke's private study already clear in her mind. Each step was firm, resolute, a testament to the journey that had brought her here and the purpose that now guided her. She knew a final, private confrontation awaited. Eleanor pushed open the heavy oak door to the Duke's private study, the cold brass handle biting into her palm. The room was a testament to a life lived in shadows and neglect, a place where time had not so much passed as merely lingered. Dust motes danced lazily in the single shaft of pale moonlight, cutting through a tall, grimy window, illuminating the forgotten corners of the space. Scattered papers, leather-bound ledgers, and empty brandy glasses littered the expansive mahogany desk, each item a silent witness to a slow, agonizing downfall. The air hung heavy with the scent of old paper and the sharp, bitter tang of desperation, a smell that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the velvet curtains and faded tapestries. Alistair Blackwood was hunched over the desk, his back to the door, a silhouette of utter defeat against the faint glow from the window. His shoulders shook with silent, agonizing sobs that vibrated through the quiet space, a soundless tremor that spoke volumes of his broken state. Eleanor stood on the threshold, a silent observer, her own heart a complex tangle of conflicting emotions. She had envisioned this exact moment countless times, rehearsed it in the quiet hours of her London townhouse, perfecting every detail of her cool, composed demeanor. Yet the raw, unvarnished pain before her, the absolute wreckage of a man, was something no ledger, no meticulously crafted business plan could ever truly prepare her for. His pride had been a formidable, imposing wall, but now it lay shattered, leaving only the vulnerable, exposed fragments of what he once was. The cold stone floor beneath her elegant shoes offered no comfort, no warmth, a chill seeping upwards that matched the atmosphere of the room. She felt the metallic tang of unspoken words on her tongue, words she had held back for years, carefully chosen for this very confrontation. He did not immediately notice her presence. His world had narrowed to the confines of his own shattered dignity. the echo of his own downfall ringing in his ears louder than any external sound. Eleanor watched the slow, laborious rise and fall of his chest, the tremor in his hands as they clutched at the edges of a thick, leather-bound ledger. The room was cold, a palpable chill seeping from the ancient walls, mirroring the frigid despair that must have settled deep within his bones. She saw the gold leaf peeling from the spines of forgotten books, the faded velvet of an armchair worn thin, with generations of use, every detail speaking of irreversible decay. This was not just a house, it was a tomb for a way of life, a monument to arrogance built upon shifting sand. She took a quiet step into the room, her intention to make her presence known without startling him. The soft rustle of her silk dress was the only sound that broke the profound stillness. The Duke flinched violently, his head snapping up, his movements stiff and jerky, as if suddenly reanimated. His eyes, red-rimmed and swollen from weeping, met hers across the expanse of the desk. They were no longer the arrogant, disdainful eyes she had known. Eyes that saw only what they wished to see, dismissing all else. They were the eyes of a man stripped bare, utterly vulnerable and completely broken. A gasp escaped his lips, a broken sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the silence, a recognition dawning in the depths of his gaze. He pushed back his heavy, leather-backed chair, the legs scraping harshly against the wooden floor, a sound that grated on Eleanor's nerves. He rose slowly, unsteadily, his once imposing frame seeming to shrink under the crushing weight of his despair. The scattered ledgers on the desk, symbols of his catastrophic financial misjudgments, now seemed to mock him with their stark numbers. He looked from the damning papers to Eleanor, then back to the papers, as if trying to reconcile the two impossible realities now converging in his study. "Miss Vance," he finally managed, his voice a raw, hoarse whisper, barely audible above the frantic pounding of his own heart. It was not the booming, imperious tones she remembered from earlier in the evening, nor the condescending drawl he had used so readily with her. This was the voice of a man with nothing left, stripped of every pretense, every ounce of his former authority. "Blackwood," he continued, gesturing vaguely around the dimly lit room with a trembling hand, "it is all gone." His gaze lingered on a large, ornate family portrait above the fireplace, a stern-faced ancestor looking down with a judgment that now seemed deserved, inescapable. A bitter laugh escaped him, a humorless, choked sound that ended in a dry sob. "My ancestors would weep to see this," he murmured, his eyes glassy. "To see me." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his fingers tangling in the strands, a gesture of profound distress. The musty smell of the room mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of burnt-out candles, and the stale scent of brandy filled his nostrils, a sensory assault to his reeling mind. The cold air felt like a physical pressure, pressing down on his temples. "I was so blind," he confessed, the words a confession ripped from his very soul, his voice cracking with the effort. "So utterly, unforgivably arrogant." He took a hesitant step closer to the desk, his eyes fixed on the damning financial papers spread out like a shroud. "I thought I was untouchable," he continued, a tremor running through his body. "I believed the Blackwood name alone would shield me from the consequences of my whims." He gestured to the ledgers again, a sweeping motion of his hand encompassing years of reckless spending and willful ignorance. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her presence a quiet, unyielding force in the room, absorbing his confession. A strange ache settled deep in her chest, a physical emptiness where she had expected only the sharp satisfaction of victory. The air was thick with his shame, a palpable weight that pressed down on them both, making it difficult to breathe. He walked slowly around the desk, his movements heavy, as if carrying an invisible, crushing burden on his shoulders. His eyes scanned the titles of the books lining the shelves, volumes of history and law that he had never bothered to truly understand, their wisdom now seeming to mock him. "I dismissed everyone," he stated, his voice gaining a flicker of self-awareness amidst the raw despair. "Everyone who tried to warn me, everyone who spoke of prudence, of responsibility." He stopped abruptly before a large antique globe, its polished surface reflecting the faint moonlight like a distorted, melancholic eye. He traced a finger along the curving lines of a continent, as if searching for a place on Earth where his past mistakes could somehow be erased. A new beginning found. I believe myself superior, he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, dry and bitter. I believe my birthright made me so. His gaze drifted back to Eleanor, a long, searching look that finally seemed to truly see her, to peel back the layers of his own prejudice. He observed the subtle sheen of her dark dress, the refined cut of her collar, the quiet strength that radiated from her composed posture. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that had been there all along, just hidden beneath the thick veil of his own blindness and disdain. The quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner seemed to amplify the profound silence between them, each second drawing out the agony of his realization. A new wave of color, a flush of deep crimson, crept up his neck and across his face, replacing the pallor of despair with a burning humiliation. The coat, he whispered, the memory hitting him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden sharp pain. His hands clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms, as if trying to ground himself in the unbearable present. You, he said, his voice barely audible, choked with a fresh surge of shame that threatened to overwhelm him. He remembered the weight of the wool, the smooth, expensive fabric against his fingers. He remembered the casual disdain in his voice as he had ordered her, presuming her a servant, an object to command. He recalled the way her fingers had brushed his, cool and steady, even as he had treated her with such utter contempt, a moment he had entirely dismissed until now. The memory was a searing brand, burning through the layers of his self-deception, illuminating his cruelty with agonizing clarity. He closed his eyes briefly, squeezing them shut, as if to physically push away the image of his own profound folly, the egregious error. The faint, subtle scent of her elegant perfume, which he had registered vaguely then dismissed as irrelevant, now seemed to fill the room, a ghost of his own profound error haunting him. He could almost feel the precise weight of his heavy wool coat in his hands, pressing down on him, a tangible representation of his arrogance, now turned into a crushing burden. The silence of the room stretched, punctuated only by the distant, mournful hoot of an owl outside the grimy window, a somber sound in the night. Eleanor watched him, her expression still unreadable, a silent statue of justice, unmoving and unwavering. Her fingers curled slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the long journey, the countless slights endured, the quiet patience cultivated over years. This was not sweet revenge, not entirely. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of his actions, a harvest reaped from seeds he himself had sown. The cold air in the study felt heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken history and shattered pride. He opened his eyes again, and this time the mixture within them was complex, almost unbearable to witness. There was shame, a profound, gut-wrenching shame that made him want to sink into the floor, to disappear from existence entirely. There was awe, a dawning, terrible respect for the woman who stood before him, the quiet architect of his undoing, her power now undeniable. And there was devastation, complete and utter, a landscape of ruins where his world had once stood, leaving nothing but an empty void. He saw the sharp, elegant cut of her jacket, the way her dark hair caught the faint moonlight, the quiet dignity that radiated from her very being. He saw the power, the immense, undeniable power that had always been there, just hidden beneath the surface of his own blinding prejudice and arrogance. The taste of dust and despair was bitter on his tongue, a constant reminder of his ruin. He felt the cold, hard reality of his loss, a physical ache in his very soul that resonated with the chill of the room. The study, once his sanctuary, his impenetrable fortress, now felt like a cage, its ancient walls closing in on him, suffocating him. He remembered the brief glint in her eye, the brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something when he had first addressed her in the hall. He had dismissed it then, attributed it to some maid's impertinence, a fleeting moment of defiance. Now he understood. It had been the fire of a coming storm, a quiet, unyielding resolve that he had been too blind, too proud to ever truly see. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, raw from weeping and the choked sobs he had tried to suppress. His gaze lingered on her face, searching for any sign of triumph, any hint of cruelty, any hint of the satisfaction he knew he would have felt in her place. He found none, only a quiet, unwavering presence, an immovable force. He finally understood the depth of his misjudgment, the unforgivable nature of his disdain, the blindness that had led him to this precipice. He had seen a maid, a servant, someone beneath him in every conceivable way. He had seen a woman whose very existence he could dismiss with a wave of his hand, whose feelings meant nothing. But now, in the wreckage of his pride, he saw Eleanor Vance. He saw the woman who had meticulously planned, who had quietly acquired, who had patiently waited for this precise moment. He saw the true master of Blackwood. His voice, still raw, still hoarse, was barely a breath, a fragile whisper in the vast, silent room. "The woman whose coat I held, you are Blackwood's true master now," he whispered, his voice thick with a profound sense of loss and self-loathing. Duke Alistair's voice barely carried through the stale, study air. "The woman whose coat I held, you are Blackwood's true master now." His shoulders slumped, face buried in his hands again, crushed by his own words. Eleanor stood watching, a silhouette against the grimy window. She had planned this moment for so long. Seeing him broken stirred both vindication and a strange, quiet sorrow within her. Justice had tipped the scales at last, after so many years of neglect and dismissal against her family. Eleanor stepped closer, her heels soft on the faded rug. The air held the scent of old paper and desperation. "Duke Alistair," her voice was calm, clear. "This is not a matter of master or servant. This is about ownership and responsibility." He flinched, slowly lifting his head. His eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, met hers. He saw her now, not as a symbol, but the woman who had dismantled his world. A shiver of deep shame ran through him. "Blackwood Manor has decayed," Eleanor continued, her gaze sweeping the dusty room. "Its lands are mismanaged. Its resources are squandered. I will restore it, breathe new life into it, and ensure its future." Her words were fact, a cold sting of truth. The Duke bowed his head, surrendering. He knew she spoke truth. Every word reflected his failures. He pictured sitting by the marble fireplace, always oblivious to the ruin creeping closer. "Your family name is linked to this estate," Eleanor conceded, surprising him. "I do not wish to erase history, but Blackwood's Forester needs diligence, foresight, and respect for its potential, not old privilege." He held his breath, waiting for the crushing blow. He pictured absolute destitution, stripped of everything. He deserved it, he knew, but the dread was cold and hard. "I will offer you a way to remain connected to Blackwood, Duke Alistair," Eleanor said, her voice unwavering. He looked up, a flicker in his gaze. "Not as owner or master, but in a capacity allowing you dignity, if you embrace a new reality." He stared, speechless. He had only imagined annihilation. The air felt thick with pride and loss. A faint pipe drip echoed his long-ignored decline. Eleanor outlined her offer clearly. "You will not reside in the main house. A well-maintained cottage on the grounds will be provided. For managing the historical archives and cataloging art, you will receive a modest stipend." She watched him for resistance. His mind reeled. Archives, art, tasks he always dismissed as beneath him. Yet, staying at Blackwood on his family's land was a painful balm, a concession he never expected. His gaze fell on the scattered ledgers, evidence of his folly, numbers he barely understood, debts foolishly accrued, all leading here. The paper felt like judgment. "Your role will be preservation, not command," Eleanor clarified. "You report to the estate manager, who reports to me. Your days of unilateral decisions are over." Her tone was firm. This was mercy, not power regained. Alistair felt profound emptiness. Command was all he knew. Now, stripped bare, he found strange relief in letting go of pretense. The world's weight lifted, even as he was crushed. He imagined the cottage, smaller but free from the manor's oppressive grandeur. He saw himself amidst neglected history, perhaps finding new purpose. The idea was unsettling, yet appealing in its simplicity. "Consider this new stewardship," Eleanor suggested, her voice softening. a chance to give back to the legacy you almost destroyed. It was an olive branch, an opportunity for redemption. The Duke met her gaze, weariness etched deep. The battle was over. He had lost his old self, but she offered a thread from the abyss. He tasted dried tears. I accept, he croaked, barely audible, a broken surrender. His head bowed in resignation. The weight of his failure pressed him down. Eleanor gave a single, small nod. Her work here was done. She had delivered justice, reclaimed what was lost, set a new course. Mercy, she knew, was a potent weapon. She turned to leave. The silence after her departure felt heavier. The Duke remained slumped, a ghost in his fading empire. As she left, she heard the soft rustle of ledgers. He was finally looking at the numbers that charted his ruin. Eleanor stepped into Blackwood Manor's grand hall. The dining room doors were closed, chatter long faded. The vast space held a faint scent of beeswax and old timber. Moonlight cut through high windows, illuminating dust motes, intricate carvings, faded portraits. She walked slowly, her gaze sweeping. This was hers now, every creaking floorboard, every whispering shadow. It was a monumental, deeply satisfying undertaking. She traced a finger along cold marble, feeling the old house vibrate. Her thoughts drifted to her first entry into this hall. The Duke, arrogant in his ignorance, had stood where she stood now. He demanded her coat, mistaking her for a servant. The heavy wool felt rough in her gloved hands. She remembered the brush of their fingers, her cold resolve. The silence had been deafening to her, though he heard only his own entitled command. That small act ignited a fire, a quiet determination to see her vision through. Now in the silent, moonlit hall, the memory played vividly. The Duke's imperious gesture, her unreadable expression, the heavy coat. It symbolized his blindness, his downfall. It was the beginning of his end and Blackwood's new dawn. A faint, knowing smile touched Eleanor's lips. Not triumph, but deep satisfaction, purpose fulfilled. The hall's chill eased, replaced by a quiet warmth from within. Blackwood Manor had a new master. Its future would be forged in steadfast, enduring strength.